For the past quarter century, the world has been hammering out trade deals and integrating markets. Then, something began to shift, and electorates in Britain and the U.S. sided with politicians promising more protection and not necessarily more trade. Here to explain the benefits and drawbacks of free trade, Craig Alexander. He's chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada, and it's always a pleasure to welcome you back to TVO.
It's great to be here.
For 25 years, we have been hearing the mantra that free trade lifts all boats. What does the record show?
Well, the record shows that from an overall economic point of view, countries benefit from access to trade. Trade creates opportunities in terms of selling goods to a broader market than your domestic market. So if you think about the Canadian economy, we're only 1.5% of the entire world economy, which basically means the bulk of the economic opportunities are actually abroad. And so to tap those global markets, trade deals reduces barriers, makes it easier to sell products internationally. It also has some benefits from the point of view of imports can reduce the cost of goods to your domestic citizens, but you also create competition, and competition actually forces businesses to be competitive and innovative. So what we've seen in aggregate is economies benefit from closer trade and investment ties. The challenge is that not everyone benefits, because when you increase trade, when you negotiate a free trade deal, you ultimately are going to create some winners and losers.
Hold off on that, because we're going to get to that in a second. Before we consider what sectors win and what sectors lose, I'd like to consider the three original partners of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I guess was signed about 25 years ago. Canada, U.S., Mexico. Who's done the best? Who's done the second best? Who's done the worst?
Well, there's no question that Mexico has benefited enormously because it's been able to tap the U.S. marketplace, but Canada has benefited, and so too has the United States. We've seen all of the members of NAFTA actually benefit. And if we think about Canada, I mean, the Canadian economy has developed along north-south lines. Like if you look at each province in Canada does more trade with the United States than they do with the other provinces. And this isn't surprising, because Canada is a small, open economy. We're spread across the entire northern border of the United States, and that basically means the Canadian economy is integrated along north-south lines. And this has been a historical experience, right? It goes back to the founding days. We've had trade relationships with America, and I think free trade helped benefit the economy in terms of creating additional opportunities.
But you just said it was a win-win-win situation, and clearly there's a huge chunk of people in the United States who don't feel it was a win, that they were one of those three wins. Are they wrong and you're right, or vice versa, or what?
No, I think that when you look at trade deals, you're going to create winners and losers. There's going to be sectors that benefit and sectors that are disadvantaged.
Let's go through them. Who are the winners?
It depends on the sector you're talking about. So, for example, when Canada went into the free trade agreement with America, one of the industries that everyone agreed was going to be adversely affected was the Ontario wine industry. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that happened was the government recognized that this sector was going to be very adversely affected. So they actually provided some funding to allow them to change their practices. And what they did basically was change the product they produced so that they could actually compete in the new trade deal.
And they did.
And they did. The Ontario wine industry thrived. An industry, for example, that didn't do well through globalization has been the Canadian textile industry, because quite frankly, Canada can't compete with places like China on manufacturing things like T-shirts. And so what's happened is there is still a textile industry in Canada, but it's very small, and it's a very niche market, and it's sort of a high-end market. What we've seen in terms of manufacturing is lower cost, more basic products, those industries have reduced in scale, and other industries, higher valued, more sophisticated production has increased. So, and we've also seen a transformation in the structure of the Canadian economy. So, for example, going from goods producing to more services oriented. And if we think, if we take the example of the city of Hamilton, I grew up near Hamilton, and it was a steel town. The dominant employers were Stelco and Dofasco. They made steel. What happened over time was that through globalization, the Canadian steel industry wasn't as competitive, and now Hamilton produces no steel, but the local economy basically adjusted to the new reality, and now Hamilton is a healthcare services and education hub.
Yep.
And you know what? It was a really painful adjustment. There was many years that Hamilton really struggled when you were going through that transformation from a traditional goods industry to a more services-oriented industry. But they did make the transformation over time. And I think when you talk about people having a backlash against globalization and against trade deals, It's the fact of the matter that it does disrupt workers, it does disrupt industries. And I think we haven't done a good enough job of actually supporting those individuals that have been adversely affected. And I think that in the case of the United States and Britain, where you've had Brexit and the election of Trump, you're actually seeing part of the backlash against the fact that globalization and trade has not lifted all boats equally.
And, well, presumably not only that, but the service jobs that have now replaced those old manufacturing jobs pay way less and tend not to be unionized than the manufacturing jobs they've represented. So as a, you know, if you got a scorecard in your hand and you're looking across societies or across cities and so on, you know, at the end of the day, are we further behind or further ahead?
Well, I'd argue we're further ahead, but that doesn't mean everyone benefited. And I think this is where you're seeing the change in the dialogue. You know, there was always groups that were, you know, against globalization. They pushed back against trade deals. They try to resist the disruption that is going to come. But there used to be champions out there that would basically tell an unambiguously positive story. And you know, one of those institutions is the International Monetary Fund. The OECD is another international body that talks about the benefits of globalization and trade. They used to champion it unambiguously, but now the dialogue has changed because now they recognize, no, wait a second, what's happened is the globalization hasn't lifted everybody equally. We've actually seen a decline in middle skill positions, middle skill jobs, decline in unionization as well. And what you can see is you have more job insecurity. You have some workers that have been left behind. In the labor market, you can see, for example, in the United States, that working age males have done much worse than working age females.
They called it a he-cession, not
right.
a recession.
And it reflects the fact of where was the industries that were the most affected? Well, it was traditional manufacturing that's seen more of the outsourcing.
But let me follow up on that, Craig, because, and we'll go back to the example you gave of steel in Hamilton a while ago. You pointed out that the government of Canada recognized that the wine industry would be adversely affected when the free trade agreement was signed, unless they gave some help to the industry to help it stay on its feet and make the improvements they needed to be competitive in the new free trade world. They didn't do that for steel. And as a result, a lot of those mills, which were very competitive back in the day, could no longer be competitive with those modernized mini mills down in the Carolinas, for example. Why didn't the government go to bat for steel the way they did for wine?
Well, I don't know the history behind it, but you could see actually how the steel industry did try to adapt. Because what you actually saw was, as there was more trade competition, they actually changed the type of steel that they were producing. So if you looked at Dofasco, it actually started to build more sophisticated types of steel than the type of steel that was coming out of Asia. And so it was an effort to sort of go up the value-added chain so that it could compete. I mean, at the end of the day, if Canada tries to compete with places like Mexico or China on the basis of wages, we're going to lose. So we actually have to build better products, more sophisticated products. The other thing, though, I'd say is that we tend to look, you know, there's been a real pushback against globalization and trade around the world in different countries to different degrees. But I'd argue that for every job that's been disrupted by trade, 4 or 5 have been disrupted by technology, right? And I think technology is actually helping to facilitate a lot of the opportunities on the trade front. So nowadays, we can have a computer software engineer in Canada working on a project with a software engineer in India and one in Latin America, and it's the technology that has allowed us to actually do that. So, you know, part of the challenge I have with the arguments that, you know, we should have protectionism is that in actual point of fact, you're not going to put the technology genie back in the bottle, nor would you want to.
Well, let me set I'm glad you've taken us here because I want to set this up. I think what was fascinating about the last election in the United States is that you essentially had the Democratic Party, which traditionally takes a more encouraging view towards protectionism than free trade view. And then you also had a Republican presidential candidate in Donald Trump, not the party, not the congressional candidates, but the presidential candidate for the Republicans, who was also preaching protectionism. And I want you, if you can, to sort of take us down the road and find out where do we go when a president of the United States is a protectionist, the Democrats in Congress are protectionists, and the Republicans in Congress may be protectionists as well because they want to stay on Trump's good side for now.
So from a Canadian point of view, this is very concerning, right? Because the Canadian economy, as I said, is small and an open economy. Exports are a terribly important part of the Canadian economy. And if trade gets disrupted, it could impact Canada adversely very badly. When we think about what's happened in terms of U.S. politics, one observation is in every American election, presidential election, you get protectionist comments being made. It plays well to the crowd. What we generally don't get is after the election, the protectionism actually coming into place. And this time, it does seem that we are going to see protectionism rise in America.
I guess we should point out that Bill Clinton was a Democrat and he did NAFTA.
Right.
So not all, you're right.
So, and I think that many Republicans are actually in favor of trade. They view trade as good. But it's clear the president has concerns. Now, when it comes to the U.S. policies, what the messages we're getting from Trump is that, he says NAFTA is a terrible deal, but every time he says that, it's immediately followed by comments about Mexico. And it's very clear his focus is the loss of U.S. jobs to low wage centers like Mexico and China. And so that's why,
to us.
As opposed to Canada. And, for a very long time, he never actually mentioned Canada when he talked about NAFTA. And I started to wonder if he knew Canada was actually part of the deal. But at the end of the day, it's clear the messaging we're getting from some of his advisors is that Canada is not the source of the problem. So, but we shouldn't be complacent because, for example, in Congress, there's currently a bill that they're considering which would put on what's called a border adjustment tax, which would impact Canada adversely. It would be effectively a protectionist measure. And if it was to come into effect, we'd actually have to get Congress to give us an exception. And that could actually be hard to negotiate. Now, Trump doesn't seem to be in favor of this border adjustment tax, so maybe it won't come into place. And perhaps Trump isn't actually worried about Canada. Our trade balance with America is close to even, whereas America runs a very big trade deficit with Mexico.
Something like what, $60–70 billion or something?
Right. So that's why I said at the start, when you said like who benefits, who benefits? Well, Mexico has been running a trade surplus with America for a long period of time. Our trade balance is actually fairly even. I think Canada and the U.S. have benefited from the integration of our manufacturing sectors. We're also increasingly benefiting from trade and services. What I really worry about when it comes to protectionism is that Canada could be collateral damage if there's protectionist measures against other countries. So for example, if you slap a tariff on imports from Mexico, well, auto parts coming from Mexico will be put together with auto parts from Canada to build a final vehicle. Well, that tariff then will impact the production of those vehicles that Canada's contributing to.
We get hit in the crossfire.
So yeah, we're an innocent bystander, but we get hit. Another one I worry about is China, is if Trump actually gets into a trade war with China. China is a huge consumer of raw materials and has a very big impact on commodity prices. Canada is a big commodity exporter. The Chinese economy is currently slowing down and they're going through an economic transformation. And if you get into a trade war, if it really hurts China, it could actually lower commodity prices and then Canada would import that weakness. So we don't have to be the target to be disadvantaged.
Adversely affected.
Yeah.
Let me give you something else to worry about, okay? And let me get your take on this. If, as the art of the deal, it's always about the art of the deal. If Mr. Trump decides that he wants to renegotiate NAFTA or rip up NAFTA or whatever he wants to do with it, and therefore we, going forward, Canada decides, okay, these three-party deals are no longer on, we're going to have to make our own bilateral agreement with the United States, what do you worry about under those circumstances?
Well, I mean, let's be honest, NAFTA is 22 years old, so it could be modernized. There's actually room for improvement. I think the things that Canadians would worry about is because America is less dependent on trade and is such a larger economy, they might have more bargaining power at the table when you're negotiating, the new terms of the bilateral deal or the changes to NAFTA. But nevertheless, there actually could be areas where Canada and the U.S. could actually agree on changes to the current regime.
Name one. What's one thing they could do to improve it?
Well, think of it this way. Over the last 22 years, e-commerce, has ballooned, and it's not actually covered under NAFTA because it really wasn't an issue back in the day. If we think about visas in terms of that identify, occupations that are particularly important to each country, so they make it easier to get a work visa. Digital employees really are not identified under NAFTA as priority skill sets. Oddly enough, economists are, and I've never understood that. But in terms of a lot of high tech occupations, we could actually improve things. In fact, there's elements of, even though Trump has said he's not going to sign TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's elements of that actually could be put into a bilateral arrangement with America that could benefit. So for example, improvements in environmental and labor restrictions. And in fact, if you did that as part of NAFTA, you could actually affect environmental issues and labor conditions in Mexico, which might actually address some of the compensation differences or the cost of production, because if you put tighter restrictions on environmental and labor concerns, it could actually raise the cost of production in Mexico and actually achieve a meritorious goal. So there's things that we could be doing. There is scope to have a constructive dialogue and look for areas for improvement. But at the same time, I think what Canadians worry about is that America is going to have a much louder voice at the table, and that when the trade-offs, I said at the start, there you get winners and losers. The worry is that those terms might not be as favorable to Canada.
In our last minute and change that, let me bring up one other concern, and now I'm going to go back almost 3 decades to the original free trade agreement negotiations between Brian Mulroney's team for Canada and Ronald Reagan's team for the United States. And I do recall hearing many times at that time, these Americans are such sharks in the negotiating table, and they are going to eat us for lunch, and we haven't got a hope of, we haven't got people who are as sharp as they are, and we have no hope of making a good deal that will be, okay, good for the U.S., but also good for Canada. Did that turn out to be the case, and should we worry about that kind of thing today?
Well, again, I think actually the economic evidence is that Canada benefited from NAFTA. I think both economies have grown. We created a lot of jobs. It is the case that you've seen a decline in manufacturing employment. But the thing I'd observe is that between '94, when NAFTA came in, and 2004, you actually had 450,000 jobs created in the manufacturing sector in Canada. The bad news was that from 2004 to 2016, we actually lost close to 600,000 jobs. So given that the first 10 years of NAFTA, we saw actual job creation in manufacturing, it would tell me that it wasn't the trade deal that was actually creating the disruption that we've seen over the last 20 years.
Technology.
It's technology. Yeah. And the other one is that, if I think about the timing, when did we see the big drop in employment in Canada? It's also when the Canadian dollar was really strong. And so I think there's a competitiveness issue here, that when the Canadian dollar was strong, Canadian companies weren't as competitive as they could have been. We lost market share. We also lost scale. So I think that there's other factors that have been at play beyond the trade deal. I think ultimately Canada negotiated a good deal in NAFTA. I actually think Canada has a lot of capacity to negotiate good trade deals. You look at our history since NAFTA, the Canadian government has signed many bilateral trade agreements, and we got CETA negotiated with Europe. I think actually Canada has a good track record of negotiating good trade deals for the country. It doesn't mean everybody's going to win. It's going to create trade-offs. In aggregate, the economy will be better off, but that doesn't mean every single worker is going to be better off. I think the real thing my real message that comes out of this discussion about the pushback about protectionism is that the advanced world, whether it's the United States or Europe or Canada, we have to do a better job of helping the workers that get displaced by the trade and the globalization and technical change. We actually haven't done as good a job as we could to help support them.
Thus, we got Trump.
Right, and so don't be surprised if people get bad outcomes that there's a political backlash, right? The good news is that we haven't had as pronounced a backlash in Canada, partly because we've actually done a better job, I think, than the Americans of dealing with the displaced workers. But that doesn't mean we haven't done a perfect job. We really need to help upskill the labor force and make it flexible and adaptive to the changing economic times. The one thing I would say is if everyone around the world throws up barriers to trade, everybody's going to be a lot worse off.
Hello, Teapot Dome. Google if you don't get the reference. Craig Alexander from the Conference Board of Canada, we always appreciate your visits to TVO. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.